We'll make a start. For those of you who don't know me, but I think you probably all know me, I'm John Stanton. I'm a co-chair of the foundation, the Berndt Foundation. And we're going to have a welcome to country to Michael that Elton Wally is going to give us now. So thanks.
Kai to you all. I'm here today on behalf of my Biennial, my elders. They're doing incredible work in incredible spaces all over the place, and it's really fantastic that they trust some of us to step in their behalf and deliver something that takes a great deal of protocol, respect, something that means a lot to us. Really, we hold this to heart. So I thank them for trusting me on their behalf, and really looking forward to sharing just a little bit of our karajan, our knowledge with you in our short window that we have today. We say kaya wanju ngama buja wanju wajak buja and jeb karajan wanging nunake. I'm looking forward to sharing just a little bit of our knowledge and a little bit of our connection here, just to leave a few of our messages, again stepping in the big shoes of our Biennial, our elders, our knowledge holders, and essentially doing my best to be that vessel, pass on some of their information and their connection to this buja, which holds a lot of our language and this space that we're in today. I always share, and this is my family story, not every family is the same, a couple of words in our culture that, as soon as you can translate, as soon as you can understand that, anyone who does speak another language will be able to attest to this idea that whenever you do translate, you can lose a little bit of that essence sometimes along the way. There's, background, experience, your family ties, everything that comes with it can really inform some of our words. So unfortunately, not every nation throughout the continent is able to draw on their language in that same way. A lot of them are going through different changes, and a lot of them are going through that process of reinvigorating. But we're fortunate to have ours. And a couple words that have been shared with my family is firstly, buja. Buja being the country that we're all here standing, sitting on today amongst each other. Buja is a connecting word. Buja connects with bujari. Bujari is when we're pregnant. Not a coincidence. These words are connected. This idea of a nutrient source, giver of life. We care for it. It cares for us. That entire process as well. The other word, very connected to this spot, is bilya. We have the Durable Yerrigan and our different bends and Jalaguru as we go down, but bilya is that term for river system. And bilya is connected with bil as well. Bil is our umbilical cord and connected in with our belly button as well. Again, no coincidence, these nutrient source provider in so many ways. And the last one shining above us today beautifully was the ngank. Ngank is our sun, mother of the stars, and ngank is our mother in our culture too. Again, I cannot speak on behalf of other families, but a lot that do have connection to this place will say we have connection to matrilineal lines through this area. We always show respect in that way, and we follow those lines in this space. So just a little bit of courage and a little bit of that connection to this area that we're in. And this is a space where we would teach. It's very fitting that, there's a university here, that there's a place of learning where people come together, where we drive issues and ideas and topics forward, because this is a space where just down here, we'd come together, our Gordandalap, the place of the betrothed through this area. We have Karakumba just over to the top. Karakumba is what my family call King's Park. Many different families have names for it. A space of abundance, a space of teaching, a space of ceremony. But every single point, when we do river walks through here down Matilda Bay all the time, it's hard to walk more than 10, 15 meters in a particular direction without running into some of these old stories, without seeing the old trees that are still here. And even with buildings, even with concrete, even with fences, our stories are still here, tied in with the barana, the animals that fly, the jerp, the birds, the trees that are all around us. As long as they're here, as long as that river system's here, our stories are tied into here as well. So again, very fitting that we can come together, share, teach, share ideas amongst each other, because again, for many thousands of generations, the Nyungar people have done so in this space as well. There's a little story I'll kind of close out with to give you a bit of an idea of that. I love to share this story by the river whenever I get a chance. My old Uncle Trevor would head out there, and he said when he was younger, they had all these different techniques and ways of catching fish. Some of our old fish traps that you could catch large amounts with. And, if you do it correctly, it works with the flow and very minimal effort once it's set, I should say. But one day they sent him out. They gave him this little bag. They crushed up this shellfish into a pulp. They said, head on out there. And they didn't give him too much information, but they trusted that it was the right time for him. So he went out there. He realized he's probably not meant to eat this stuff, so he started to put it into the water. And they gave him a gidgee, 3-pronged spear. And eventually he started to see these small gilgit come, his fish. And his life lessons had kicked in all those steps beforehand, and he realized these are too small. He could identify them, not the right time. So he waited, kept feeding. He said more and more came, larger ones came, and eventually some came that he could catch and no one would be angry about. But something in him told him to wait a little bit longer. Again, those life lessons kicked in at the right time, and his respect for his culture played its part. Eventually, an extremely large fish came through, very unusual, very rare, he said. And he said he waited, and he threw his spear in. And he said he caught it. His version is he caught it, but he said he caught it. And I always like to share that because he came back in and he said, again, his version sometimes 45 minutes to an hour. But he shared this idea that he could have caught many fish and he could have worked with different ways and techniques and fast-tracked this process. But clearly his elders knew it was the right time for him to go through this process where he learned patience and respect. He showed respect to his culture at each stage. Those lessons kicked in at the right time, and he essentially showed patience and understood that, eventually that right large fish would come and present itself. So I'd love to just leave that story with you. Many different times I've shared this over the last 10, 12 years, and it means something different to me at different points in my life. But those are just some of those lessons that we teach in this space. And I'd like to say, Marmanjana Nunak Nunak Calling Bolbuja, Mortbuja, Mortmaya, wherever we travel to after this time, the space we have together, we ask those good spirits to look out for you. If you're traveling to the faraway country, you've gone long distances, back to your home, back to your family, wherever that is, we ask those good spirits to look out for you. And if you're not a spiritual person, again, patience and respect being a huge part of the talk today. Respect is universal, part of all of our cultures, and many different people coming together to share today. Again, your time, food, water, and your thoughts. So we thank you for your respect through this process. And again, thank you to my elders for trusting me to step in. I'll close out with a little bit of didgeridoo for you all. This is not a traditional instrument from here, but I just thought, what a nice way to kind of close this out as well. Haven't played in about 2 weeks, so we'll see how we go. Go. Thank you again to the university. Thank you for bringing us in and continuing to show this respect. Respect is a two-way street, so we appreciate that, and my respect goes out to each and every one of you, and I appreciate your time. Can I get that back? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alton. I'll just say very few words. Just first off, the housekeeping is if there was an emergency in here, you need to leave through that crash door and go out onto the oval or go through this way here, which is not likely to happen, but we have to give that. I also acknowledge that we're standing on Wajik Nyunga Budja, as Alton has already said, But the interesting thing is that this campus and this particular building is located on land that was a very large and important camp, long predating European presence in this area. So it's very appropriate that we have a continuity of teaching, of learning with the past. This is the 11th biennial lecture of the Ronald and Catherine Berndt Research Foundation. We haven't had a lecture like this for a few years because we had to suspend our activities due to COVID, and then after that there was a large university restructure, but that's now behind us. The foundation was endowed by a bequest from Ron and Catherine Berndt to promote the discipline of anthropology more broadly in Western Australia, and supporting and encouraging research in Aboriginal Australia. We also include cognate disciplines, not just anthropology as a general thing, but also social anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, social history, other cognate disciplines. One of our key activities is, in fact, every year to grant awards. That's the main function of the Foundation Committee. It's a very pleasant function, is that we give away money. And I have to give my thanks to the committee that I work with, and to Elle as co-chair, and particularly to Petra, who's our admin officer and who's been largely responsible for organising this meeting. So we support the provision of awards, research awards, scholarships. We support publications and the dissemination of research. And we do this at a national level. This is not just a West Australian thing. It started off that way, but we're extending our work across the country. You'll see some flyers that have been placed around here by Petra, and I urge you to take them away and maybe spread the information that's in them to any colleagues and friends or students or whatever, because our 2026 grant scheme applications for that will be opening at the end of the month. More than anything, I welcome Michael as tonight's speaker. I've known Michael for a long time. We have a lot in common. But that's not why we invited him. We invited him because of his particular interests in issues about the representation and the development of identity, of social and cultural identity, particularly in the context of the history of Australia, both ancient and modern. He comes from the Logan River Nerang area in southeast Queensland. He prefers not to use a language identity because of some of the complexities involved with that, and he may well address that in tonight's talk. But his activities since he started working in the sector of arts and culture in 1985 have been extensive, focusing on documentation, as the title says, of urban Aboriginal identities, histories and cultures. We share a particular interest, and one or two of you here also share this interest in historical photographs, which are a very important European artefact, which had become even more significant with the passing of time for First Nations peoples in Australia. They document presence that cannot be refuted. He's also an anthropology graduate from the University of Queensland. As you can see, he's also director of the other anthropology museum in this country. So I won't say anything more, but I'd like to welcome you to our presence here, and also thank you to Elton.
Thanks, John, for the committee for the invitation to be here today, and the welcome. Thank you very much. And thanks for advancing the first slide to get things started. So, I'll start with I guess a brief overview of my history, and I'll show lots of photos as I do in every presentation, and then move on to my contribution to as a witness to the Queensland's short-lived Truth and Healing Inquiry. So starting with this is a photo of the man standing in the uniform in the middle is my father's father, with both his parents, who both came over from Scotland. And then my father had his teenage sweetheart, my grandmother, to come over, and they married. So I've got two Scottish-born grandparents on my father's side. And then the man here is my grandfather's father's father, so my great-great-grandfather from Scotland. And then before I start starting to talk about my mother's family, as I grew up, every Saturday morning I would be looked after by my Auntie Mary. And in a sense, as a young child, I just called her Auntie Mary without actually knowing why I called her Auntie. And that's her standing in the middle with her daughter in front, Mibri, who I knew quite well in later years. And I grew up without any grandparents because my father's parents had both died before I was born. My mother's mother died several years before I was born, and my mother's father died a few months after I was born. So I didn't really know what a grandparent was. And I remember I was a very small child, and my Auntie Mary showed me this photo and pointed to the lady on her left, and said, "That's your grandmother. Your grandmother was my sister." And I'm like, wow. So this is, in a sense, this was like my first genealogical lesson. And I remember her saying, your grandmother was a fine woman. So I went away with this great, first impression. And I guess since then, I've done a lot of genealogical work. Here we have, that's my grandmother there with her father. So he was Scottish and of Scottish and Irish descent. That's actually Mary there. And then my grandmother's mother, Jenny Graham, who came from the Logan River region in southeast Queensland, sort of halfway between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. And then my great-grandfather here and his Aboriginal wife settled on the Nerang River, basically at the town of Southport, where Surfers Paradise now is. And again, it's gone. Yeah, that's my grandmother there with her oldest brother Frank and other family members, and Auntie Mary standing there. So this is, and they're standing in front of the house where my mother grew up. So sort of three generations all grew up in that one house. So here's, from my photographic research and talking to family members, my great-grandparents had 11 children, and I've managed to track down 9 photographs from those 11 children. 2 died as young children. There's my grandmother, Edith, the youngest of the siblings born in 1899. And then here, talking about my grandfather's family, the woman over there on the far side with the dark dress, that's my grandfather's grandmother and my grandfather's grandfather. And my great-grandmother was an older sibling to some of these children, so she was already having children by this stage, 1907, and wasn't in the photo. So this man, Jackie, with the controversial name used by many, given to many Aboriginal people, was my 3 greats-grandfather. So that's my grandfather's grandmother's father, and he came from the Lower Logan area, and my great-great-grandmother settled in the Upper Logan area. So all in that southeast corner in between Brisbane and New South Wales. And then from my great-grandmother's family, this is her here, Eliza. There's 12 children in that family, and I've managed to track down all 12 photos of that family, which I think to me really, with both families, me being able to find this many photos really indicates strong connections to country, but also financial stability and economic success, and a desire to, in a sense, avoid government legislation and do everything they could to remain in their country and keep their families together, which has a lot to do with, avoiding the legislations of the time. And here is my grandfather, my mother's father, Stanley, with his younger siblings. So That's all the children, excepting one who died young, managed to find photos of. And my grandfather with his bullock team, and he sold the bullock team in 1933 and moved to Southport to be with my grandmother's family. Again, in front of that same house I was talking about, he bought a truck and then later sold that truck, went to the First World War, came back and bought a boat and was a professional fisherman. And I guess you could say my grandmother's family our family trade is moving dirt around. So many people have worked in transport, both transporting timber, transporting concrete, transporting milk, transporting sand, building roads. It's sort of those industries that have enabled our family to stay on country. Here's my grandmother there again with her sister. My mother is the small girl over there, all in front of this house, the family home. More photos. This is Auntie Mary there with her husband and two of her grandchildren. My mum's brother and two of his closest cousins. My grandmother there again. And looking at the changing landscape, this is what my hometown of Southport and Surfers Paradise looked like when I was a small boy. This photo would have been taken about 1965. My family were living in houses along this stretch of river. 5 different sort of families living along that stretch. Another family working in the oyster industry not far away on a nearby island. And then the place has changed so much. These 2 photos, 59 to 2018, were basically taken in the exact same place, looking in the same direction. And if you turn around from this view, you see this view and the old family home. This photo would have been taken exactly where those palm trees are. So that's my Auntie Mary's block of land and my grandmother's block of land there. Everything has changed, and my Uncle Jimmy here, and that house in the background is exactly where that house in the corner is there. So, I'm just showing my genealogy and the changing landscape. And as an example of that, this is, that similar view to what I just showed before. Surfers Paradise, all the high-rise, the canal estates. My mother lives in a high-rise right about there. This is the view from her veranda, looking at the very spot where she grew up from her front veranda. So she's 87, in good health, and living right on country, seeing exactly where she was born. And here's a family photo of me there. I've had an older brother who I think took this photo, and my dad and my mum in the late 1960s. So, quick overview of my family. Now I'll move on to the interesting process I went through. Last year I was approached to meet with a legal team in one of the big city offices in George Street, Brisbane. Walk in, there's about a dozen legal people there, and I was asked to be an expert witness in the Queensland's Truth and Healing Inquiry. So the inquiry was established by an Act of Parliament by the Labor government in 2023, which committed to a 3-year process of this inquiry. So then they put together this legal team with Josh Creamer as the chair. And my invitation was to actually present at the very first session. So my first thing was I was not confident about being asked to be a expert witness. I didn't like the bit about being an expert of Aboriginal history. And they said, well, we don't have to use that term. And the reason and they explained the reason why I was being asked to speak in this first session, because I was really kind of, why me? Why do you want me? They were looking, because it was a 3-year process, or supposed to be a 3-year process. They wanted Aboriginal people who were confident and used to telling their story, so they could get the actual processes of how to set up the inquiry, how to ask cameras, even how to record, how to set up the seating arrangements, all those small things that would help inform the committee, the inquiry, and also, I guess, looking back at previous Aboriginal inquiries that have looked at people who have been damaged through government processes and protecting them, and which sort of amazed me. They kept asking all these questions. All this support was offered to me, social workers and legal support and all these questions. And I said, look, I'm a curator. I do curators talks all the time. I'm used to this. But it was interesting that the level of care they were showing. And again, the confident people that were asked to talk in this first 3 days, and even though some of them had some very horrific stories to tell, they were still people used to it. And then obviously over time they would move on to people who are potentially damaged, and this may well be a very stressful process. So, I guess the big part of the story is that the inquiry literally lasted 4 days. It started, there was this first session that lasted like 3 days, and then the second session, I think was a week or so later. It literally only lasted 4 hours. They had brief interviews with 6 or so heads of government departments in Queensland. They were talking to written submissions. I think there was about 12 written submissions, and 6 or 7 Director Generals briefly spoke about them. Then there was an election, and the Liberal government got in, and the incoming Liberal Premier, or who looked like he was going to win, assured the chair that there would be a respectful closure of the inquiry, but in actual fact it wasn't respectful at all. He was simply asked a question in a press release. He said, "Yep, it's over." No discussion with the chair, with the members. No press release, nothing. Just the very first sitting of Parliament, I think 11 o'clock at night on a Friday night, they snuck this motion in to another bill, and it was over. So in that month where they knew it was going to end, the people involved, the board, the members had to basically get what they had documented online, pay several years' rent for a website in advance so that it would be safe, and it was a sad end. So I think it was interesting for me to be involved in this sort of a legal process. So I'll let the King's Counsel sum up my introduction.
And I will just commence by introducing our first participant, Mr. Michael Aird, who, as you've heard from Ms. Cleese, is the Director of the Anthropology Museum at the University of Queensland. Mr. Aird is a different category of participant than those from whom the inquiry has heard this week. Mr. Aird and his family have their own lived experience that is material to this inquiry's terms of reference, but he's also devoted much of his professional life to examining the experiences of First Nations people in Queensland through the medium of photography, a discipline that's known as visual anthropology. There is a close connection between Michael Aird's work and the terms of reference of this inquiry. As you will hear today, much of Mr. Aird's work is looking at the tactics of survival, at how First Nations people living in fear of intervention under the Act strategised to keep their families together and protect them from the so-called protection policies of the day. But Mr. Aird's work also seeks to highlight the strength and the resilience of those subject to the Act, to look past the idea that these individuals were solely victims in the pure sense, to tell the more complex and nuanced story of their lives during this time in our state's history. I ought to note for completeness for those attending today that Mr. Aird's evidence will be accompanied by photographs of deceased First Nations people and may include distressing themes related to removals and life on reserves. Mr. Aird, I understand that you would like to take the oath. Can I ask you please to just read the oath that is there in front of you?
So, I guess, yeah. So I was in an interesting situation where I've got a legal team basically curating my career. They were going through everything I've ever written and produced, and the things that they couldn't find, they'd personally come to my office and ask for copies of books, which they then copy. And they twice came to my office at the university and interviewed me and filmed me and made transcripts from those recordings, and then put together quite I forget how many pages, quite a thick statement from me based on their interviews and their transcriptions of what I said, and then gave me the opportunity to check. So I actually spent 3 whole days editing that very long statement, and in the end I actually was happy with what I was supposed to have said, and very happy with, in a sense, the legal team's choice of which bits of my career to focus on. And I guess I trusted them that the bits they chose to focus on was helping to serve a political purpose as the inquiry, to add to the inquiry, I guess, to give balance to what other Aboriginal people were saying. So really the very first two questions from the legal team was, one, why did I leave my first career as a sheet metal worker, making air conditioning ducting, to working in Aboriginal history, and then the types of things that have motivated me. And this quote I was asked about, it was a quote from Thomas Wellesby, who's a well-known amateur historian from the Brisbane region, and he was actually working as a young bank clerk in Brisbane, in Queen Street, Brisbane, in 1874, and then later in life he writes this. And I guess I was in this, like, this quote I think guides a lot of the work I do, in the sense that here's a person that looked at Aboriginal people as human beings, rather than this mythical people who, lives, a dying or remnant or whatever, thing. He just looked at them as people, and a lot of his writings, you can see that. So we discussed, an issue like this. Then on to the book, Portraits of Elders, the first book I produced through the Queensland Museum. And really with this photo, we didn't actually talk about the person. We just talked about the whole issue of breastplates, and and me talking about the complexities of these metal plates, which I won't expand right now. And then my three great-grandfather, that I've already shown you another photo of him, talked about him and the complexities of Europeans giving people names such as Jackie or King Charlie or King Billy, these repetitive names that appear. So there's a whole another issue, the types of things that I've focused on. And then this is all still within the book, still looking at elements from the book Portraits of Elders, the issue of Rosie Campbell. And when I was doing the book back in 1991 to 93, this lady, Rosie, still had several grandchildren still alive. In fact, one of her daughters married one of my mother's cousins, and I think she still has at least one grandchild still alive. And yet here's the family, the way the family saw Rosie in this photo, surrounded by family. And that photo, the other photo of her bare-breasted, taken by a professional photographer, is held at the Queensland Museum. So I think one of the big things I was trying to achieve with the whole Portraits of Elders project was these two types of histories, the histories that Aboriginal people hold and the histories that institutions hold. And quite often there's quite a disconnection. So I was trying to bring those two histories together, and the ownership of photographs. And again, I was asked, why did I put this photo, why did I include this photograph? Because the photograph is in the book. There was an attached sort of paragraph and heading where this man, King Sandy of Boona, was referred to as King of Shreds and Patches. And the words were, he wouldn't pose for a photograph without being paid a shilling. The newspaper article at the time was doing everything they could to denigrate this man and make him out to be a sad remnant of a dying race. And again, I'm being asked, why did I put this in? Well, I put it in to show these different versions of Aboriginal history. And moving on to my grandmother, my mother's mother there, and her older sister, and Aboriginal people coming into studios and paying to have photographs taken and trying to conform. And here, again, these photos are all from the Portraits of Elders project. My great grandmother Jenny, again, there's my grandmother there, the small girl in front with her parents. And I mean, this story, my great grandfather was a river pilot was his title, or we'd say harbour master today, of the Nerang River, and he had access to, government knowledge. He would have access to public servants and be aware of legislation. So when the 1897 legislation, protective legislation, was introduced into Queensland, the first major legislation starting to control Aboriginal people's lives, my grandfather the following year took his Aboriginal wife, who he'd already had Aboriginal partner, who he'd had 10 children with, to the local Anglican church and got married. And that, to me, that was as you've already heard the term said, tactics of survival. That was him strategizing to avoid the government intervening with his life. And my grandmother, born 1899, was the only child born into that marriage, official marriage. And then the front cover of the book was this photo. So this was, an example of, of Aboriginal people looking quite confident in this studio setting. So my next comment, I'm being asked about this photograph, so I'll play that.
And, those tactics of survival you talk about, do you see the very fact of a photograph like this being taken as being part of that? And if so, why?
Well, I've heard from many white families that they don't have photos like this within their family collections because their families were too poor. That's coming from white families. And so that makes me think that these people made a political choice to part with their money to pay this photographer to have this photo taken. So to me, that's, and to buy those expensive clothes. They are they're political decisions they made, economic and political decisions. And I felt part of the reason so many photos like this exist within my family, both my grandmother and grandfather's families, is because they were spending their lives working hard, fitting into the economic system so they could do things like this. And they were showing off their successes, in a sense saying to the white society, we may be Aboriginal, but you can't take our children away because we're as good as everybody else.
And I think you said...
So with that photograph, I should have said they are my grandfather's aunties, my great-grandmother's younger sisters. And again, when I was doing this research, they had several, grandchildren and nieces and nephews still alive at the time. And it was, and looking at that photograph, you can see they're wearing white makeup. They've got gloves on their hands to hide their dark skin. Their clothes are very, expensive European clothes. They're doing everything they can to look European. Yet when you talk to their nieces and nephews and grandchildren who knew them personally, they were proud Aboriginal people who really stood up for Aboriginal rights and and they had been under the Government Act and had to seek exemption and had to state that they had that they were literate and they could handle money and they would not habitually associate with other Aboriginal people to get exemption, and they so that's the life they lived through, and so here's me, showing their photographs, but also getting to know them through people that did actually know them personally. Another story, again in the book Portraits of Elders, was of Nell Cameron. You'll see here, she, her son or nephew or adopted son, I was friends with it, and he talked about it with great pride about how she had a very successful career as a maid. She was the head maid upstairs at the Bellevue Hotel in Brisbane. So apparently that was quite prestigious. She was very proud of that. But then her brother dies and she had to adopt her brother's son, Bill, and she had to get him educated. So she took a step down with her career and moved to Yeppoon near Rockhampton in central Queensland to a Catholic boarding school, St Brendan's, and got a job in the laundry so that with the job her son could be educated, which was, when I said that, when I mentioned St Brendan's, I looked at the chair, Josh Creamer, and he just smiled and said, my biography, he went to school at St Brendan's. And so it's just another story about, these people and the lives they lived, and these photographs tell these stories. So basically the rest of my presentation to the inquiry focused on the exhibition I did in 2012 at the State Library of Queensland, where I worked with the artist Vernon Arkey and his connection to the Norman Tyndale and Joseph Birdsall photos that were documented in 1938, a 6-month period in 1938 in Queensland and 2 communities in northern New South Wales. And I guess there's several people here today that know well the history, the legacy of Norman Tyndale and how the complexities of what Aboriginal people think of him, of his work, whether he got things right or wrong. But of course, this particular part of his career was a very racist studying basically the qualities of Aboriginal black skin and the qualities of black the way Aboriginal people will look in the future with intermarriage with other races, and so I'm looking at the document. His 1,100 of the 5,000 or so people he documented in an 18-month period, and of those 1,100 was N.E.R. Sam, who was Bernard Arquet's great grandmother. Her husband, and her son-in-law were so Vernon's grandmother and Vernon's grandfather and Vernon's grandmother's parents. So those three were documented by Tyndale. Vernon's grandmother was there, but she didn't get documented in any way, on Palm Island in North Queensland near Townsville. And Vernon knew about these photographs because as a child, his grandmother would have the small copies of these three photographs in her wallet. So as a child, he would see them. Then as a young art student, he got access to bigger, better quality copies of these photos from the State Library of Queensland, early 1990s. Norman Tyndale, I think in the 80s, agreed for his research to be distributed, and so certain bodies such as the State Library of Queensland got copies of relevant photos. Only a small part of the collection, really. And so Vernon had that, and then in about, I think it was 2000, so in the 1990s he got access to one version, one copy. Then he got access to the actual high-res scans of the original negatives. In about 2000 he visited the South Australian Museum. Apparently he was about the first person ever to get access to these high-res scans. He took these high-res scans back to his studio, blew them up, and he was amazed at the tones. He says, we thought our great-grandmother was wearing a white dress, but there's a floral pattern. He's looking at skin tone. And then, as you'll see, here's the photo of his great-grandfather, photos, the front and the back side photos. And these photos are only, 50 millimetre square each. And so Vernon blew them up. You'll see behind him the photos of his great-grandfather into 3 metre by 2 metre charcoal portraits. And they became an important part of this exhibition. And it was great working with Vernon. He was a great help. So that's these portraits of his great-grandfather and his great-grandmother. And as well as that, Vernon and I went to the South Australian Museum and we got more high-res scans and decided to blow them up to 2 metre prints. And you'll see some of them here. And you'll see in some of the original handwriting from Tyndale's genealogies and quotes that he wrote down, you'll see them as art, his vinyl lettering up high. And even the green wall was inspired by the green binding of the Tyndale genealogies and the yellowy white background, the yellow card, the yellowness of the cards that you'll see. And I assume there's a few people in this room who have seen Tyndale's original material. So, and within that story, I guess these photographs, the legacy of Tyndale, he was doing, in a sense, very racist work, the way he was treating Aboriginal people, documenting, like Vernon's great-grandmother, her written on a card is that her entire life's menstrual history cycle is written down. The Monsell colour chart was held against her skin in 5 different places, a sample of her hair, the measurement of her skull, all these things were all documented. But within those stories is, I guess, an incredibly sad story, and it's actually being told by Flo Watson, the lady you see in the corner behind me. So it was wonderful to have her. As I'm talking about her, she's actually sitting there. She was the next speaker after me in the inquiry. But her story is particularly sad because her mother survived a massacre. So we'll get to that. So you'll just hear the way I'm summing that up.
That story or journey that's told through this exhibition is that of Auntie Flo Watson, who we're very privileged to have here today and from whom the members will be hearing from later today. Obviously, Auntie Flo will tell her own story, but could I ask you just to briefly touch upon her journey as reflected in the Tyndale exhibition? And I might just ask the operator to please display figure 27 while that's happening.
Yeah, well, very grateful to have Auntie Flo contribute to the project. So it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't just about Vernon's story. I spoke to many people in 2012, and really the things I was asking them I mean, I wasn't asking them in a sense about their lives in general. I was asking them about their journey with these photos. But in the process of asking people about their connection to these photos, many aspects of their families' lives were told, and I documented them. And as Flo will tell us later, it's a very sad story. She has some very sad stories about what her family went through. Found it very upsetting. And then, of course, with Auntie Flo's typing what her mother went through as a young child, an incredibly challenging story. And also other stories about people who very sadly, how they lived in fear of white people, who hated white people because of how badly they were treated. And how they were in fear of, interacting in society. They didn't feel equal to others. These stories were so sad to be telling, in a sense, for me to be the one typing and editing them, and and deciding which one of these stories should be told. So, as I said before about the first people in the first session were people confident in telling their story. So even as bad as Flo's story is, she has been telling this story for many years and she was confident, but yet when it was her time to tell the story, she did get upset, and they did have a pause for, I think, 20 minutes or so before the inquiry resumed. But putting it briefly, here she is at the opening event, incredibly proud to see these family photos. I think that's her father's mother there right behind her mother on the far side. But her mother survived a massacre on the Palmer River in Cape York as a 5-year-old girl. And she had a bullet in her hip and spent the rest of her life with a limp. Her older sister, 10 years old, was knocked out of a tree with the butt of a rifle and spent the rest of her life with a scar on her face. And as part of this research, we visited the daughter of that lady, who coincidentally, when we visited her near Kuranda in North Queensland, I think one of the things Vernon and I joked about, we could have titled this exhibition "Tyndale is a Bastard," but we chose not to. And then when we arrived, we said, we're here to her house. We said, we're here to talk about Norman Tyndale. And she said, that bastard. He lined us all up at the timber mill and made us all get photographed. And my father was sick that day, and we told him not to get photographed. And he said, oh, no, don't worry. Nobody will ever see this. But in fact, his photo ended up in the exhibition with his daughter's permission. But back to Flo, that's Flo's cousin was talking. Another brother was shot dead at that massacre. The grandmother was shot dead. And the surviving siblings, all depending on their age, were all sent to different missions, church and state-run missions. So incredibly sad story. And she talked about cousins and aunties that, all the things they went through. Here is a father, here is her mother. And even things like her mother arrived at Yarrabah Mission with nothing but a singlet, a bullet in her hip, a singlet, no underpants, no shoes, nothing else. Not even a birth date. So she ended up, they had to invent a birth date. All the kids had the same birthday. I think it was the 1st of July. And it was through me showing her Tyndale's research, she actually found out what date her mother was born and what date her father was born. She said, we were treated like racehorses. We all had the same birthday. And so it was this whole process like this, I think no other project has done it to me, but I basically spent so much time typing and crying because I'm looking at these photographs, these people were so real, and then typing the words. And another thing was that Tyndale, he wrote, mainly with men on several of the reserves, he actually wrote down some political comments from these men, basically criticising the way the missions are being administered. And I was typing some of them, they were incredible to read those things. And then, of course, I'm talking to family members who, who were talking about how bad their parents were treated throughout their lives. So it really was challenging. And then I guess one of the most amazing, I think to me, one of the most amazing parts of the story was getting to meet Chad Morgan. Chad Morgan, for those who don't know, is a famous country singer who only just recently passed away around Christmas time. He became famous in the 1950s. His last album was I'm Not Dead Yet. He's managed to live a good life. And basically he kept his Aboriginality secret. And I think over the decades, I think lots of Aboriginal people knew he was Aboriginal, but I think most of the white people did not know he was Aboriginal. And then a few years back, he wrote a song. He basically came out. He wrote this song that had his entire genealogy, Aboriginal genealogy in this song. So I remember hearing that song, writing some notes, and then it was when I was working on the Tyndale photos, I go, hey, these are all Chad Morgan's family. And another coincidence was that Joseph Birdsall had a camera with colour film in it. So, and he only took a very small number of colour photos on the trip, but just happened to be all of Chad's family. This is Chad's great grandmother there, Annie Conlon. Chad's grandmother's sister and Chad's mother's cousins, Chad's great-grandmother's second husband and Chad's great-grandmother's stepson. And Chad grew up with these people. He grew up with his grandmother. He was the oldest child. His mother had some very large number of children. He said the only time he actually saw his siblings was that when his mother was having another child, and they'd all come and stay with the grandmother. And hearing him talk about his great-grandmother was just incredible, the knowledge, the passion, and he had no idea these photos existed. So I asked him about his song, and then asked him to come to the launch of the exhibition and play this song to everybody. And the best part was having Chad call me from the car park, say, I need someone to carry my guitar. So I thought I really am famous now. I got to carry Chad Morgan's guitar. And he introduced himself with, I bet you're all wondering why a hillbilly comedian is sitting here. And and he sang, and then from there, afterwards, everybody wanted to have their photo taken with Uncle Chad, and then I had to hold his walking sticks because he didn't want them in the photos. So it was incredible, to have him there. So I'll just finish with my last comments to the inquiry.
Before we finish up, is there anything else, and there's no pressure to do so, you'd like to tell the members about your own story or your work, material to our terms of reference?
I guess, I feel very fortunate. Working in the arts and cultural industry is a tough industry. It really is. There's not a lot of money generally. Not many people get rich from it. But I feel, very fortunate that I've survived, financially, and I'm still here. I feel very fortunate that I've worked with so many good people, and that I've been trusted with their stories as well is quite an honour. And in many ways, I try and tell stories that reflect on my family background, my understanding of Aboriginal history from what I grew up with, and also acknowledging that my family's history is probably far more fortunate than many other Aboriginal people who have not had the advantages that I've had, grown up in a place like the Gold Coast. Compare people who grew up on government settlements, so much different to my upbringing. And I guess so I try and tell, the variety of stories out there that, and there's just so many stories to tell, and I guess I just do my small part in trying to tell some of those stories accurately.
And am I...
So, it's certainly not just professionals like me who do this work. There is so many, amateur, ordinary Aboriginal people in the community who all do their bit to document history and culture and do brilliant work at it.
Thank you, Mr. Aird, for being here today. Members, at the end, we do have a copy of Chad Morgan's song about his grandparents. So with your permission, we'd like to play that.
I think it's only appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's do it.
Colourly woman, waka waka man. How they came to be together, no one could understand. They were born to obey Mother Nature's plan. This colourly woman and a waka waka man. Heber Anderson was born at Thargomindah, where the Buller River flows. Bill Hopkins was born at Nan Stanley, where the great tall timber grows. Heber's father was a red-haired Scotsman, the mined opals in the great outback. Her mother was a colourly woman, she was a full-blood black. Colourly woman, red-haired Scotsman, raising a family as best they can. Two different cultures, one happy clan. This colourly woman and a wild Scots man.
So I think that's enough, yeah. And I guess the only thing to say is, in conclusion, is this I think lasted 1 hour 15 minutes. The actual statement, to the inquiry, but the actual written statement probably included a few extra things, so it was sort of compacted. But I guess at the end of the day, interesting. I'm really talking about the decisions I've made as a professional, and why I've made these choices. And in some ways, I guess when I finished my sort of statements, that in some ways I felt it really wasn't about my family, it wasn't about me, it was really about my work. But in fact, especially, in the last few days, going back and listening to the questions over and over again, I guess so much of what is discussed is about, me trying to put my family's history in context and then contrasting that with other families that live very, very different stories. And I think one of and I guess I made a point of not being too personal about my history, about incidents of racism and different things that have happened, which I could have easily talked about. But, I've really felt that I was happy to go with the legal advice, not the legal advice, but, with their strategy in a sense. And probably the most personal statement I did make, and I'm sure my mother wouldn't like to hear this and probably would say it never happened. But when I was a very small, so this is one thing I did say to the inquirer, that when I was asking about these incidents of these tactics of survival, I just mentioned that when I was a very small boy, I remember climbing a fence and ripping my pants and then going and asking my mother to fix them up. And she had a sewing machine, she could make clothes if she wanted. And she said, no, throw them out. And we'll buy new ones. And I think thinking back on that was her thinking she didn't want people to see her children walking around in patched clothes, because that could lead to people thinking, well, they're Aboriginal, they're poor. So in a sense, after this whole opportunity to tell the inquiry anything I wanted, I chose to really not tell, that's the most personal thing I said. There were other things I could have said, but I sort of, was happy to go with the way it ended up. So I think that's enough. Thanks for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. I mean, that was a very powerful and moving account of what you've been doing and the context of what you've been doing. But I think what really made it was the song at the end.
I'll just say that, as a professional, and I have many Indigenous artist friends, and I'm always defending them. Now, I've said this many times, possibly I may offend a few people tonight, but I really think contemporary artists do a better job at portraying the complexities of Aboriginal history, quite often better than history professionals themselves. So I was so proud to have an artist finishing my statement.
Excellent. Okay. Well, look, we don't have questions at this kind of function. I'd like to thank you again on behalf of everybody here, and invite you to join us outside for drinks and nibbles and things. So thank you again. That was a wonderful.